Hello, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I am on with Max Kratov. We're going to be talking about Genesis 1:1, how to translate the very first verse in the Bible. What are the implications? Today, and specifically, we're talking in a response. Somebody made a response to a video that me and Max did in the past, that where Max essentially argued that it should be translated as when God began to create, or in the beginning, which God created the heavens and the earth, which has a lot of odd, crazy implications for how we read the text. Now, in this video, someone responded to us, basically disagreeing and laid out a number of different points, and we're going to respond to that today. That person was Michael Flowers. He has a YouTube channel, and I found it very helpful for explaining the discussion. He wasn't rude at all. He was actually very nice, and he even commented in our video and was very nice about it and asked for discussion and all that kind of stuff. But Max and I decided that it would be easier and more helpful to just respond here so we could lay out our views really easily. But Max, thank you so much for coming on here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I like carrying on discussions rather than just opening them up and leaving them there. So this is great.
I think this will be really helpful for understanding like the back and forth, what this discussion is about, and specifically in Isaiah, because that's a really important passage. So before we get into that whole Isaiah and the video, could you just really quickly, just so people understand what we talked about in the first video, which will be linked in the description, what would you say is like your case for interpreting Genesis 1:1? So first, talk about just really quickly the different views, and then what is your argument for how you interpret it?
All right. Well, when we read Genesis 1:1, there's debate about whether it should be translated in the beginning or something along the lines of in the beginning when God began to create, or in the beginning that God began to create, where the beginning is sort of defined by what follows. And so when people try to land on which one is more correct or which is actually intended by the author, oftentimes they go to other passages and other usages of the word beginning there, which is an important thing to do. But we disagree on like what those other passages imply for Genesis 1:1. When I look at all the evidence of all the temporal uses of Reshith, which is like 18, I think it was, I found, I see that they're all used in the construct state, except for one instance, and that's Isaiah 46:10, and that's where a lot of the debate focuses, and that's where we focused. But other than that, really all the uses are in the construct state, and they yield a relative meaning where the beginning is defined by its head clause. And so I think that because of all the usages, it becomes unique and awkward to read Genesis 1:1 the traditional way, where it's on its own, it has no article, it's an absolute state, but somehow it has a very specific and very defined meaning.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so yeah, let's dive into the video. Just for clarity for the audience, in the video, in the first 10 minutes or so, he's actually responding to Daniel McClellan, someone that's been on the channel here, and he's responding to his arguments for it, and actually me and Max actually both agree with his critique of a couple of things there. With that being said, he also talks about like a little bit of summary of the topic. So we're kind of jumping in right in the middle when he really starts to talk about like our video in particular. So I'm going to put it on the screen now, and boom, there it is. So let's watch it here.
The term is also used in the absolute state in Isaiah 46:10, where we read, Magid mereshit acharit. This verse is talking about the beginning and the end of Cyrus's calling or reign. God declared both of these things before they happened. Now, I feel like I need to reiterate here some of what I said a moment ago, because I've heard at least 2 individuals on YouTube trying to dismiss the relevance of Isaiah 46:10, and I think it's because they're misunderstanding something.
The beginning here, that word, Reshith, in verse 10, it's also relative in meaning. That phrase is like more like a proverb. The point is, it could be translated something like declaring start from finish. There's no articles there, start, finish. It's not the start and finish of time. It's just idea. Like there's a finish line, there's a start. And the point is Yahweh declares the finish from the start. It's not about which finish, it's not about which start. It's just the point is that he can do that, right?
So when I'm looking at the interpretation, like when God began to create in the beginning, my two options are like one absolute starting point and one like relative, like not, it doesn't specifically say what the starting point is. That's how I'm looking at the context. So in Isaiah 46:10, if we're going to interpret the same way, like I guess those are our two options. When it says, I make known the end from the beginning, is in this context, are you saying the beginning is like a relative, like long period of time, or is it just a certain period of time, or is it an exact period of time, or am I completely missing the point of what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. But it would be helpful just to rephrase the word beginning to like start. Because like just even in English, the word beginning, it has these connotations, right?
Yeah.
Actually, the way I'm trying to explain this verse in Isaiah, that's how most evangelical, like major commentators put it, which really surprised me. Presumably the same people who would be defending the traditional view in Genesis 1:1, they all have a similar translation. It's somewhere along the lines of this: declaring or announcing the outcome from the beginning or the start. And some of them don't even have the article. So it could be announcing the outcome from the start or from, and so like you could translate it that way. And obviously when you would read that, you wouldn't think like the point is about the beginning of time. The idea is just generic. It's just general. It's not specific. That's the whole point, is that in general, God can declare things.
So, yeah, I really don't think these guys understand what the issue is here. The issue is not whether Reshit is being used to speak about the absolute beginning of the world. When commentators say that in this verse, Reshit is used in the absolute state, they just mean that it's not in the construct state. If it were in the construct state, we would expect it to be followed by a noun, pronoun, or infinitive construct, as in this phrase, Bereshit Mamlakut Yehoiakim, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. In this phrase, the word Reshit is being qualified by two words, Mamlakut and Yehoiakim. In this type of construction, Reshit is said to be a nomen regens, the leading noun, and Mamlakut is a nomen rectum noun, the noun at the rear part of the construct chain. It has a genitival relationship with Reshit. Yehoiakim is another nomen rectum noun that qualifies both Mamlakut and Reshit. Isaiah 46:10 is different from this verse because it uses Reshit without any nomen rectum nouns, pronouns, or infinitive constructs. So when you hear the word absolute, don't think of this as the opposite of relative. We often talk about things like time or morality being either absolute or relative, but that's not how the term absolute is used in Hebrew grammar. The issue is not whether the Isaiah passage is talking about a unique event in history, the absolute beginning of the world, or whether it's talking about an event that can only be understood in relation to other events in history. In this verse, Reshit isn't modified by a nomen rectum, whether a noun, pronoun, or infinitive construct. That means it's in the absolute and not the construct state.
So you actually agree with a lot of this, if not all, right? So the debate is not whether it's absolute, because the opposite of absolute would be construct, and it's clearly not in construct, right? Because as you pointed out, there's no nomen rectum, there's nothing to be in construct with, correct?
All right. So the first thing we need to talk about in his response is just the fact that he's misunderstood me, and he was claiming that I misunderstood the grammatical concepts. And so he criticizes my use of the terms absolute and relative. Now, there is confusion in the debate generally, which is why I use those terms and why he said I was confused. The problem is grammarians and people in this discussion use the term absolute in two different ways, and the same with relative. So they use absolute grammatically to talk about the absolute state versus the construct state, and they use it semantically to talk about the meaning. So they talk about an absolute meaning. And so the main scholars that I was interacting with when I wrote my paper on this subject were using the term absolute to talk about the meaning. So they'd point to Isaiah 46:10 and they'd say, look, the meaning here is absolute. It's the absolute beginning of time. So that's why I was using that language. And so I'm not conflating the grammatical concepts and the semantic concepts here as he accuses me of doing. So that's the first issue here, is just the little miscommunication there. And granted, wasn't the clearest clip there. So that wasn't ideal. But as far as the interpretation of Isaiah 46:10 grammatically, the grammatical concepts are understood. And as he goes on to exposit there, we agree grammatically, at least, that it is in the absolute state because there's nothing following it. There's no way to read it in the construct state. It has to be.
Thank you. All right. And just for some clarity there, it's also possible that I might have said something in the video. I didn't even rewatch it. And I'm not a scholar on this topic. I feel like I know a lot, but it's possible I might have misspoke, or you, Max, you might have misspoke, or it's possible I don't understand. I meant that. So it's possible he might have said something based off what I said. I have no idea. But either way, yeah, that clears up that. All right. So ready to keep going?
Okay. And a different but also relevant grammatical question that needs to be asked here is whether mereshit in this verse is referring to some definite event in history from the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or some indefinite event from a beginning of Cyrus's reign. It's clearly talking about the former. So I think the grammatical issues are not really being understood here. No one is claiming that Isaiah 46:10 is talking about the beginning of the world. Well, I shouldn't say that because I can't really speak for everyone. But if anyone is claiming that, then I'd tell him the same thing. He's not understanding grammatical concepts and is therefore missing the point of why this text is relevant to our understanding of Genesis 1:1.
Okay, so he said a couple things there. He said this is a question of referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, like the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or a beginning of Cyrus's reign. He says that it's clearly talking about the beginning of Cyrus's reign, and also that nobody is claiming Isaiah 46:10 is talking about the beginning of the world. So did you have any thoughts to add there?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I just want to congratulate him in as far as the direction he's taking the discussion, because I think he's right. And the main thing I was pushing for was for scholars to actually read Isaiah 46:10 in context and to bring it into the discussion that way. So he doesn't read it as referring to the beginning of time, which is surprising. Now I'm curious to see how that's going to shape the discussion moving forward. And he's saying that no one is claiming that. Well, that's the problem. People are claiming that. And that is the entire traditional appeal to Isaiah 46:10. So, for example, if you look at the major commentaries which have summarized the debate and sort of presented the traditional view, so like Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary, Kenneth Matthews, New American Commentary, I think Victor Hamilton as well in the New International Series, they will all summarize the debate and talk about the arguments that I'm making and others are making, and quickly point to Isaiah 46:10 and say something along the lines of, here it is referring to the beginning of time in the absolute state without an article. Therefore, we can see that in Genesis 1:1. So as best as I can tell, the shape of the scholarly discussion has assumed that Isaiah 46:10 does refer to the beginning of time. So it is sort of surprising to me that that impression is Michael doesn't have that impression of the discussion. Now he doesn't go that direction, So the arguments that I make against those scholars won't work against him, I guess. That's the first thing about the fact that no one's claiming it. So, and Walter Eickrot, I don't know how to pronounce it. He wrote an article in a collected essays once, and it sort of became like a classic thing to cite. And so Kenneth Matthews does, and he says, Walter Eickrot has demonstrated that Isaiah 46:10 must be understood as a reference to the beginning of time. So, that's how I understand the debate to go. Michael Flowers doesn't plug himself into that, and so that's interesting and intriguing. Now, as far as the other thing he was saying about actually interpreting Isaiah 46:10, whether it is to be understood relatively or definitely, he ends up with the view, if I understand him correctly, that it does refer specifically to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, and he says that a couple of times. So his interpretation of that grammar and that verse is specific, like refers to the beginning of Cyrus's reign. I actually don't think it primarily refers to Cyrus's reign. I think it has Cyrus's reign in view, but I think it actually means something more generally. I referred to it as a proverb. Sometimes scholars talk about a gnomic sense. And that's, in my paper, I talked about the poetic structure of the passage and how it moves from general to specific. It moves from declaring finish from start down into the passage to talking about a bird of prey from the east, blah, 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 Cyrus doing my will, right? So he moves from general to specific. And so for that reason, I think that the verse, it's in a primary meaning is general, but it has Cyrus in view. And I do think that's an important distinction, because then we can no longer say that the grammar is equated with the specifics of the start of Cyrus's reign. Rather, I think the grammar is an arthros. There's no article. And it also corresponds to that general indistinct meaning that, like I was saying, God has this ability and he does these things. And it's so Isaiah 46:10, I don't agree with him that it specifically refers to Cyrus like directly. And I think I mentioned that in my paper. So a couple commentators understand it to refer to God's prophetic utterances in general. And I think that's also a good interpretation, is that statement is just sort of summarizing God's prophetic activities through his servants. So, and he will mention that again, and maybe we can get into those details more later on. But I will say here, I don't think it's that important how we hash this specific detail out about whether if it directly refers to Cyrus. What we primarily need to be talking about is the grammatical features, how those grammatical features connect to the interpretation of the verse, and then how that little package compares to Genesis 1:1.
Okay.
And so we can disagree about the specifics and the details of Isaiah 46:10, but what we need to talk about is the grammatical features, and that's what he moves on to do.
You said a few things there. So specifically, you were saying that you don't think this is about King Cyrus, right?
Well, it's about King Cyrus, but when like if we're talking about the direct referent of the grammar, that's different than there's layers to, like, when language is being like used, there's layers of reference. And I think when we talk about the grammar of it, we're trying to talk about the closest referent. So when it's said that I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come, I think the precise definition of what is meant has nothing to do with Cyrus. The precise definition is that God is, the prophet is speaking on behalf of Yahweh, and Yahweh is declaring his ability to predict things in the future. So that's what can be said. That's what it means. And then once we ask, why is he saying that? Well, he's saying that because he's about to make a prediction about Cyrus. So that's what I'm saying. So Cyrus is in view, and the passage goes on to ultimately refer to him. But when we talk about the grammatical features, which are the fact that Reshith here is in the absolute state and it has no article, and we ask, what does that imply? Well, I think those grammatical features are very appropriate for this general meaning of just that God makes predictions, right? Does that make sense?
Okay, and so just for some clarity there, so he in his video he says the question is referring if it's referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign or a beginning of Cyrus's reign, but you don't think it's talking about the beginning and end of Cyrus's reign at all, right? And I mean, it seems to me like it says things like long ago, which is in reference, remember the former things, ancient times, what is still to come. Those words don't like yell Cyrus's reign. Is that kind of your argument there?
Sort of. Again, we're getting into the sort of that can be confusing.
Okay.
I guess I'll try to put it in another way.
Okay.
Well, okay. We can read through the passage and I think that would help. So,
Okay.
Verse 9, the prophet's calling the people to remember the former things that happened long ago, presumably powerful acts of God and prophetic acts of God, because there's statements about his uniqueness, his superiority in verse 9. And then he makes it explicit what they're supposed to remember. They're supposed to remember, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. So there's a poetic little parallelism. Making known end from beginning is parallel to from ancient times, what is still to come. And so that parallelism explicates what is being talked about. So end corresponds to things still to come. And beginning starts from things way back when. So if you read that first line in verse 10 on its own, yeah, you can come away with an idea that God is saying that he declares the end of history from the beginning of history. But ancient times is very sort of open-ended, and what is still to come is also open-ended. So firstly, that observation helps us start off on this leg of generality. So it starts off in verse 10 being general. And then at the second half of verse 10, I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. And so that highlights the general interpretation I'm giving, is that God is establishing his prophetic ability, and he does what he wants. And then in verse 11, he gets more specific than that. From the east, I summon a bird of prey. So this is clearly about to be something more historical and more precise. From a far-off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. So here we can tell he's going somewhere with this. But when you're reading the passage, you're not quite sure. We keep reading, what I have said that I will bring about, what I have planned to do that I will do. So there you go. The first half of that verse is hinting at the specific thing in history that Yahweh is predicting. And then the second half relates that back to the proverb. So I'm about to summon a bird of prey from the east. And what does that mean? That means I'm about to bring about what I'm going to do, and I'm about to fulfill what I predicted. So there's this, Isaiah is bringing together the ideas of God's general sovereignty and general prophetic activity with the specific example. And that's part of my argument here, is that like Cyrus is in view, and that's the specific historical thing that's being referred to, but that's being put into a context of Yahweh generally making predictions and prophetic declarations. And and I guess that's the last verse in that sort of thought right there.
Yeah. Okay. And so just for the audience, so this make known the end from the beginning. So you don't think that's in reference to the end of Cyrus's reign, the beginning of Cyrus's reign, correct?
I think when Yahweh is saying that, and through Isaiah, I think they have that in mind. Because they know in verse 11 they're about to specify it, right? They have it in mind. But it's not, that's not the first like intended layer of meaning. So it's general, and the passage opens generally, intending to go and talk about Cyrus, but that doesn't change the fact that that first verse was general. And that's important because that's when we start making arguments about there's no article and that's significant. It's an absolute state and that's significant, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so in addition to that, thank you for explaining. In the video, he says it's a question of whether it's referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign or a beginning of Cyrus's reign. So you don't think that's what the debate is over?
Right. Like when you put the question that way, he's right. Obviously, we would have to say in the beginning of Cyrus's reign. But I don't think that's the right way to put the question, because it's not the beginning of Cyrus's reign. It's the end from the beginning. What is it? Higiv meireshith echerith. Okay. So he's importing the interpretation of the whole passage into the interpretation of that specific line, which is, it's a valid thing to do. But I think he goes too far to relate the grammar of the line to the interpretation of the passage. I think the grammar of the line corresponds to the interpretation of the line, so on and so forth. And from there, you build up to the interpretation of the passage. But when we talk about the grammar and how that relates to the meaning, we go line by line and not by the whole passage, I think. Who knows? Maybe it's important.
Bam, look at that.
Okay. And a different but also relevant grammatical question that needs to be asked here is whether mereshit in this verse is referring to some definite event in history from the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or some indefinite event from a beginning of Cyrus's reign. It's clearly talking about the former. So I think the grammatical issues are not really being understood here.
I messed up. It should be 1626.
Well, that's a good place to stop, though.
Okay. All right. What do you have to say there?
Now that I've heard how he said that again, it is an important question to ask whether Reshith refers to a definite, what did he say, beginning in history or an indefinite. Now, the way he puts that broad question is important, and that's a great question. But the way that he fills in the examples of that question, I disagree with. So he ends up interpreting it as it refers to a definite beginning in history. And that's where we disagree. I think it refers to any and all reshiths that Yahweh happens to speak about. And that includes Cyrus's reign. So I wouldn't say it refers to a beginning of Cyrus's reign. I'd say it refers to a beginning. One of those beginnings is Cyrus's reign.
I see. So it's not a question of the beginning of Cyrus's reign and a beginning of Cyrus's reign. For you, it's the question of the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or I guess, yeah, the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or many beginnings and one including Cyrus's reign.
Yeah, more or less.
I probably could have worded it better there.
Well, okay. It's tough because we're talking about different layers of interpretation that I'm working with and he's working with, and we're trying to combine them. But no, I think that's a fair way of putting it.
Okay.
No one is claiming that Isaiah 46:10 is talking about the beginning of the world. Well, I shouldn't say that because I can't really speak for everyone. But if anyone is claiming that, then I'd tell him the same thing. He's not understanding grammatical concepts and is therefore missing the point of why this text is relevant to our understanding of Genesis 1:1. It's relevant for two reasons. First, because it shows that when the noun reshit is used in the absolute state, it's spelled the same way as when it's in the construct state. Second, it shows that the noun doesn't have to be written with a definite article or with some other definite nomen rectum word linked to it in order for it to be considered definite. I'll have more to say about the term's definiteness in just a bit. So again, we don't have to understand Isaiah 46:10 as referring to the absolute beginning of the world. We're just looking at this term for its grammatical features, and that in itself can't tell us whether the author is talking about the absolute beginning of the world or the beginning of some event that can only be understood in relation to other events in history. Additional data would need to be considered in order for us to discern anything about that particular issue. In Isaiah,
Okay. He says that this shows that when Rashid is in absolute state, it is spelled with the same consonants as when it's in the construct state, and that you would agree with, once again, correct?
Yeah, of course.
All right. And then second of all, shows that the noun doesn't have to be written with a definite article or with another nomen rectum word connected to it. Do you agree with that part?
Yes. So,
Okay.
And this is hopefully the bread and butter of our discussion, is we want to talk about the significance of Isaiah 46:10. And so that includes the grammatical analysis and how it relates to Genesis 1:1. What's weird is that I agree with him on the grammar here. I think there's confusion about how it relates to Genesis 1:1. And I don't know how he relates it to Genesis 1:1, which is something, Michael, if you're watching, I'd love to hear more about. Like, how do you actually put together the relevance of Isaiah 46:10 with Genesis 1:1 grammatically, and how the semantics refers to that grammar? Because typically it's done in a way that he disagrees with. Typically it's done this way. Well, Reshith is in the absolute state. It has no article. So it can be in the absolute state in Genesis 1:1, which then means we are free to assign its interpretation in Genesis 1:1, not attached to the rest of the verse, but on its own. And that will typically take on this beginning of history interpretation. But he's denying that train of thought. So I really actually don't know how he relates this verse to Genesis 1:1, and nothing he says actually like bolsters his view. It's just allowing for it.
So maybe it'd be good to talk about it here, but it's my understanding that, just judging by the way he said, the question is referring to if it's in the beginning or a beginning. I guess he thinks that, well, okay, or maybe that's not in response to you, I don't know. But either way, so it seems like he would take the position that it's referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign. So it doesn't refer to exactly to the very beginning of time in general, but the beginning of Cyrus's reign. And that way it is used in an absolute way. And if it's used in an absolute way here, then we can say, okay, it's using, then that gives us the ability to say it's being used in an absolute way in Genesis 1. Does that sound right?
Actually, that might be. Now, I hate to speculate about the arguments he's making and how he would proceed with them, but actually, that's a great guess. I think maybe his point would be that if the interpretation here is in the beginning of Cyrus's reign, then we can read the same thing in Genesis 1:1. But I doubt he'd say that, because then you would translate Genesis 1:1 in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, and that's not the traditional view. And that's my point. Even if you want to make Genesis 46:10 definite, and it seems like Mr. Flowers has come up with a way to do that, understand it in the beginning of Cyrus's reign. My point is that you've proved my point that Reshith is relative, and it requires a governing like thing to be the beginning of. So we can understand it definitely in the beginning of Cyrus's reign, but we need Cyrus's reign to finish that thought. And I think it always entails that. And that was part of my paper, is that in Isaiah 46:10, it's in the absolute state and there's nothing following it, but it logically assumes that something would follow it. God declares the beginning of that event, of that war, of that utterance. He declares the end from it. It's just that it's because he's trying to be general, he omits all of those things that it would be the beginning of, just to be general. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Sweet.
Okay, let's watch and see what else he has to say here.
Isaiah 46:10, Reshit refers to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, or perhaps the beginning of his calling. It's in the absolute state, just like in Deuteronomy 33:21 and Nehemiah 12:44, because it's not being modified by another word. And it's definite, even though it doesn't have the article. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Now, the other piece of evidence that Dan McClellan mentions as
So it's definite because it doesn't have the article. You would agree with that as well?
No, and that's where our appeal to Isaiah 46:10 is different. It looks like so. So did he just say Meireshith in Isaiah 46:10 is definite in meaning without the article? I think
Yes.
that's what. Right. Yeah, and that is the traditional appeal to Isaiah 46:10 is to say that the interpretation is definite, but the grammar is indefinite. And so then they'd say we don't need to have an article in Genesis 1:1 for it to mean in the beginning. And I think at that point we're back to ground one. And I'd say, well, that again, that's just not what Isaiah 46:10 means. It doesn't say in the beginning of Cyrus's reign. It just doesn't say that. That might be the interpretation of it ultimately. But I don't think it's appropriate to relate that interpretation to the grammar. So it's wrong to say that the interpretation of the entire passage corresponds to the lack of the article on this one word, right? I think the lack of the article is there so that it can be general and so that eventually it can be whittled down to Cyrus. So I think we would disagree on whether or not Reshith is actually meant to be interpreted as to be definite in meaning there in Isaiah 46:10. I think it's indefinite in meaning. It's open-ended.
So he's saying that it refers to the beginning of Cyrus's reign. So it's definite that it's referring to the specific beginning of Cyrus's reign. But
I think that's what he said.
Yes. But you would also say that if that's the case, then it's still indefinite in regards to it has to have, or sorry, let me rephrase it. It's still relative in that it has to have something to be the object that the beginning corresponds to.
Yeah.
So does it, just from a grammatical perspective, do you think it makes sense to say that his interpretation is actually definite?
Well, to answer that question, I'd have to hear the details of how he would make that argument more specifically. So I can't say.
Okay.
But I think it's ungrammatical to make Isaiah 46:10 and that first line in Isaiah 46:10 to be referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign directly. I think it refers to Cyrus indirectly, but to say that the grammar itself is related to that idea, I think that is, I think, a misstep, and I think that's where the grammatical justification breaks down.
Hypothetically, if it does refer, and I know you think it's wrong, but hypothetically, if it did refer to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, declaring the end from the beginning of Cyrus's reign, then is there a conceivable way that you can think of to conclude that that would be referring to something that's definite?
Say the last part.
Is there any conceivable way where you would think of the word Mebershit being used in a definite way?
So in other words, if I accept his interpretation hypothetically, would I then have ground to say that it can be without the article but interpreted definitely?
Yes.
Yeah. If what he's saying is would be correct, then yes, we would have a good justifiable appeal to Isaiah 46:10 for a traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:1. But I just I see multiple things in the context, in the grammar, in the Septuagint translation of the passage. A lot of things pointing away from interpreting that line as directly referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign.
Mm-hmm. And just for the audience, so it seemed like earlier you said the beginning of Cyrus's reign is relative in regards to it needs an object, that like the beginning Mereshit is not like on its own essentially. So in this instance, are you using relative and I thought you said that earlier relative and absolute were like contradictory.
Yes. If we're talking about absolute meaning versus relative meaning,
I apologize. Let me restate that. I'll cut that out. Relative and definite, are they contradictory?
Depends if we're talking about grammar or semantics.
Semantics.
Yes, they're different. So, and that's how I intend to use the words. So, I like when something's definite, it's like we know what we're talking about. It's like when we're talking about it, both of our minds conceive of the same object. That's what the article does. The man. So we have the same man in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Versus relative, I guess, is the opposite of that. I guess maybe relative is a bad word choice because all I mean is that it's, what shall we say? I've been saying open-ended, but like the opposite of definite really would just be like undefined, like non-specific, maybe is a better word.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it seems to me like you said, if he was referring to the beginning of Cyrus's reign, that would still be like earlier you said the beginning of Cyrus's reign. If that was the interpretation that is in reference here, then it still needs a referent, an object to like essentially latch on to. Therefore, it's still relative, and therefore it can't be used as justification in Genesis 1:1 for it being absolute. But then later it seems like you said that if the beginning of Cyrus's reign is what's being said here, then that would be justification for it being absolute in Genesis 1:1. I hope that makes sense. What did I miss there?
Yeah. I think the I did roughly say those two things, and it's because in one situation I was focusing on the interpretation, and in the other I was talking about the grammar. So just now we were talking about the grammar.
Mm-hmm.
I can accept if Mereshith ultimately refers to the beginning of Cyrus's reign. I can accept the lack of the article to be an appropriate use of referring to something specific. But if we're just talking about the interpretation, that situation would prove that the word Reshith implies a theoretical specific situation, and in this situation, it would be Cyrus's reign.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for explaining that.
I'm not convinced, though, that this is actually how the author wanted us to read the text. The non-specificity would have only provoked the reader to ask, which beginning? Were there other ones before this one? The line of questioning that would then have followed would have only distracted from what the author was presumably trying to communicate. You know, the whole story about God creating everything in 6 days, as this is narrated in the rest of the chapter. Of course, we could always posit that the author's intended audience already knew that there were earlier beginnings before the one that's mentioned here. And if that's true, then I suppose no one would have started asking about other beginnings and lost the plot on what the author was trying to say. But that would be gratuitously speculative. It's more natural, in my opinion, to understand the opening phrase in Genesis 1:1 to mean, in the beginning. In fact, since the absolute and construct forms of Reshit are the same, there's nothing to prevent us from vocalizing the text as Ba-Reshit.
All right. So then he goes on to this hypothetical scenario where the vowels in the Masoretic text are wrong. Essentially what he's saying there is like, hey, no, there is an option of saying in a beginning translation, but he doesn't think it's a good one. And it's because it would have distract the non-specificity would have distracted and made people ask, "Oh, which beginning are you referring to?" Which would have distracted from the audience. So, or the text. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I generally agree with his statements. The grammatical possibility is there to understand it as in a beginning, God created the heavens and earth,
Mm.
or skies and land. But that statement is so like it doesn't fly under the radar. It's so unspecific that it really does raise questions, like he's saying. And I do think it would be distracting from the main point of the passage. So, like when Homestead brought up this view, and the viewers should watch that interview. It was interesting, and Homestead's a fantastic scholar and awesome guy, apparently. When he was bringing up the possibility, Zach had to immediately ask the question, like, what other beginnings are talked about, and Homestead actually had some ideas maybe what that would mean. I think that's inevitably what is gonna be raised in the mind of a reader in that situation, and I just can't imagine, at least right now, that that's the sort of direction that the story is intended to go. And so, yeah, it is just distracting because the story is clearly about all these other things. It's about Yahweh. It's about the creation of the cosmos as a temple, the installation of humanity as his priestly rulers and his kings, his co-regents as the images of God. It's about this beginning, this specific beginning. And so to leave it open-ended like that, I think just goes against the grain of sort of the whole thrust of the passage.
I see.
Now,
Well, yeah.
So I think me and Michael are the same in that regard. It's just we replace that view with different interpretations. So he sort of, what shall we say, like protects against that by having in the beginning, this is the beginning, and I would defend against that speculative situation by saying that it's a specific beginning in which God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, yeah, that's really interesting. I certainly admit, like from our perspective, certainly, yeah, it begs the question of, yeah, it's like which beginning you referred to, and naturally, that's a question I think most people would ask. But I'm not terribly convinced that the ancient reader would say the same thing, because something also Dr. Holmes said in the interview is that the purpose of these kinds of texts is that like these creation cosmogony texts in the ancient Near East is to tell us, like from the Israelite perspective, what they see now, like ask like what's the purpose of what we see now, what we have today. Like it's not talking about all the other gods of the other cultures. Um, you know, there's a question of like, well, whatever did the Israelites believe in these other gods? But you could say the same thing about like the Enuma Elish or the Egyptian texts. Like they're not talking about the other gods of the other cultures. They're not talking about the other peoples. They're talking about their specific context, what's important to them, where they are there today. In a lot of ways, it's explaining how we got here, maybe not in a literal way. So if you have that understanding of like, hey, this creation tech is not supposed to be talking about everybody else, then naturally, like it'd be like, okay, yeah, surely there's other beginnings. We all know that, but what is our beginning? And I could go into a little bit more about why we would think that the ancient Israelite would also have that understanding of the context before even reading the passage. I'm interested what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I do think it's true that an ancient person would be more open to that idea of a beginning and multiple beginnings than we as a modern audience would be. But I still don't understand how an Israelite would be open to the idea of multiple beginnings of the cosmos. Like we can talk about multiple beginnings of people groups, and there are cosmogonies that refer to their own identities and mission and things like that. But Genesis 1 is clearly cosmic. It's intended to be, if not universal, at least to cover the planet, the whole land, right? So if that much is clear, then the other beginnings would have to be what? Like other planets? So if maybe that's a wrong conclusion, but
I think it would depend on how you view the Genesis text or these other texts of, ancient Near East. So like someone like John Walton doesn't think that it's talking about, the like, yes, he does think it's talking about the entire world, but it's not like some original creation state where nothing else existed before that. Like, it's more functional, and Homestead would go along those lines. But that's also one of the reasons why we could be more confident that there's that kind of context built in, and that's because there was an inherent functional nature to these texts, and there might have been some material aspect. I think, I don't know if Walton would say this specifically, but Homestead would say like, hey, uh, you know, the building blocks already existed, but he's just putting them to the right place. Not literally, but does that make sense? Or does that change anything?
Yes. So I think it's helpful to attempt to limit the scope of, for example, Genesis 1 based on the worldview of its readers. But I don't think that when you do that, you limit it so much that it's not speaking about everything. And let me defend that. So, and I think John Walton would agree with this. Ultimately, the way I understand John Walton in his various books is that Genesis 1:1 begins with the state of chaos and primordial waters. And I don't think the Israelites meant by that there were building blocks. So I actually don't think Homestead's way of putting it's very helpful or precise. They began with the very beginning, but for them, the very beginning was a state of chaos, and they envisioned it as primordial waters, and so and Leviathan and such. So I think for them that symbolic world implied everything. Like I don't think they thought that, hey, our world began with primordial waters and chaos, but maybe beyond that there was an ordered world where other beginnings happened. I still think that view of uncreation was cosmic and even temporal. I think that when they thought back to that cosmic uncreated state, I think for them that also would have been temporal, like this goes way back. And I think I've read John Walton say that for them that is non-existence, the existence of water, the way we would put it.
Or at least like a lack of function. But let me think about it like this. So Walton thinks that Genesis 1:1, or not Genesis 1, Genesis 1 in general, marks I guess the time period, something like that, where not like millions of years ago, not when the Israelite thinks the very time period began. Like there are things that existed before that. Like it's not like there was no creation out of nothing. John Walton thinks that like from our eyes today, it would still look the same, but in the ancient mind, like it, the text is describing like the functional aspects being put into place, not necessarily, not anything material involved. So in that way, if I'm understanding it correctly, then there could be other beginnings of the material world, but they just didn't care about that, or other beginnings of, I don't know, maybe other cultures. Does that make any sense? Does that change anything for you?
I think when you start putting it that way, you can open up possibilities for other beginnings. But but something you said is important. They didn't care about those, right? So I don't think it makes sense to build it into the opening of your cosmogony to say, hey, there were other cosmogonies, but this is ours. And actually, maybe that does make sense. Maybe there's a contrast there. But when you say in a beginning, you're not just avoiding other beginnings. You're actually like actively putting those
Yeah.
like before the reader, and
Mhm.
that is what I take issue with. I don't understand that being done. Like I
Mhm.
don't think that's being said.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. I think there's one aspect I'm open to the idea that maybe the ancient writer of who wrote Genesis, Moses, or whoever, was like, um, in a beginning. It just sounds like a good way to put it. Or, obviously it's Bereshit in Hebrew, but in his mind, in a beginning, and he wasn't like thinking, oh shoot, how people are going to respond to this if they're going to automatically ask, oh, what other beginnings? Um, like I'm open to that idea. I don't know how possible or strong that is. I don't know. I've never written a creation account, so I don't. That's not something I think about. But um, I don't know. I think that, see, there's a possibility. I guess the reason I mention it is like, I think there's a lot we don't know. I personally would not say that it's gratuitously speculative. I think there's multiple ways we can think of situations where they would have this as the main idea in a beginning. Uh, but as you said before, we don't necessarily have to take a specific translation. And that way, maybe it is a little bit more possible, or maybe a lot possible, that it should be interpreted as like, in the beginning, which, or sorry, yeah, in the beginning, which God created the heavens and the earth. Um, but yeah, any last thoughts there?
Well, firstly, I do prefer to try to aim for a translation and not necessarily just have the options open. My concluding thought would be I'm also open to it, and even if it sounds weird to me, if someone could demonstrably prove how it would make sense within an Israelite faith in their conceptual world,
Mhm.
and not be horribly destructive to the flow of thought of Genesis 1, I'd be open to that. I'd need to think about it more, but yeah, I think that would, for me to be convinced of that, I'd need to see a more full-fledged presentation of how that's being done.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Hey, and maybe when more people take the in a beginning understanding seriously, we'll get a bunch of papers out, right?
Right, when they reckon with the grammar, maybe that's when we'll start thinking about it.
Yes, yes, yes. All right, awesome. All right, well, it's been fun having you on here.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts as far as the overall discussion? Could you just like really summarize like what your argument was, how it doesn't necessarily seem like he uh, messed up the argument, and more specifically, it seems like he just kind of left up to open the possibility, didn't necessarily argue for it. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So what we talked about today is his response to our clip focusing on Isaiah 46:10, and we talked about how he misunderstood what I was saying about absolute versus indefinite. Ultimately, I think where we landed was that he is departing from a traditional defense of the translation of Genesis 1:1, which I find intriguing, but he hasn't, like I couldn't tell what his explicit reasoning was to defend it. Traditional translation of Genesis 1:1, and so we kind of try to speculate about how he reads Isaiah 46:10, whether it's definite or not, whether it's referring to Cyrus's reign or not. And again, I'd love some clarification for Michael, and I am open to conversation still if he's interested in that. But yeah, as far as I still see it, I don't think Isaiah 46:10 is a grammatical case for the traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:1.
Hmm. Okay, and just for clarity there, um, so you think that the one of the strongest reasons to accept your view, like this in the beginning, which when God began to create, and the possibility of in a beginning, is because in Isaiah you don't really see it being used as the traditional way of in the beginning, or in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Um, so that means it's not possible. But at the same time, I do want to ask, if he is right that there is a possibility of this being used this way in Isaiah, like he wants to say it is, if the in the beginning interpretation is still possible, at what point is that like what does that mean for you? Does that mean if he's right about that, is it possible? Yeah, is it possible that we should read it that way in the traditional understanding? I assume you'd say yes. And if so, where does that make the conversation? Like, is your interpretation still, you think, more likely, or is it just like they're all possible in that instance? What do you think there?
So the grammatical possibility of the translation of the NRSV and such has been decided. It is grammatical. It is possible. And I'd appeal to the work of Robert Homestead there. The debate really is which is more likely or which is best. And so I think that the unmarked relative clause interpretation of Homestead and the NRSV is, or sort of NRSV, is the most likely, just because the word is reshith is always used non-specifically, like it always requires other things to specify it. And the one exception is Isaiah 46:10. And if it turned out that Michael was right about Isaiah 46:10, then all that would mean is that my case would rest on 19 uses and 1 versus a unanimous testimony to the translation of the NRSV. So my argument is that everywhere reshith is non-specific and it has this relative meaning to other things. Therefore, it's the same in Genesis 1:1. If Isaiah 46:10 is the exception, I don't think it is, but if it is, that just means that there is one exception, and I still think the weight of evidence would push us towards in the beginning when God began to create.
I see. Gotcha. Right now, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. So, yeah, one instant doesn't mean it's. So it means it's possible if it's possible, but there's still a lot of other instances. So naturally, if someone's going to use that word in an ancient text, naturally they're going to be thinking of the other 19 or 18 instances compared to just that one instance.
Right. And let me add, to put it on the offense, I think the traditional view, if Isaiah 46:10 is not interpreted as Michael Flower says, the traditional view is ungrammatical, and there is no grammatical basis for it. But if what Michael Flowers is saying is valid, then suddenly it would be grammatically possible. So I'm deciding based on weight of evidence. But if we want to talk about what's possible and what's not possible, then I would say if he's right, then it would be grammatically possible, the traditional interpretation.
Got it. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate it. And no books so far, no articles. Still doing this out of the goodness of your heart, huh?
Yeah, put it that way.
Okay. Oh, well, thanks so much, Max.
Yeah, well, it was a pleasure and it was fun. Thank you.
Awesome. And once again, I do appreciate Michael's video for the clarifications, and appreciate any interaction going forward. You should check out his channel. His understanding of this topic and explanations are helpful. But otherwise, thank you guys.